Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. By now, our viewers are well aware of the mysterious circumstances in which Edgar Allan Poe died. About 5 days after leaving Richmond, Virginia, he turned up semi-conscious and dressed in someone else's clothes at a Baltimore polling place on Election Day. He had no memory of how he got there, what happened to his clothes, or even why he was in Baltimore. From there, he was taken to a hospital where he died 4 days later without ever being able to reveal the mystery of those missing days. Well, as we unravel the enigma of Poe's final days, we're repeatedly asking the question, what was Poe doing in Baltimore? There just might be a clue in the last thing Poe ever wrote. And that will be the subject of tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. You might have heard of the last painting that Vincent van Gogh was working on when he died, or how about the last painting that was on Rembrandt's easel? Well, what was the last thing that Edgar Allan Poe wrote before he died? Well, we have a few different contenders. We know the last short story he was working on that remained unfinished was about a lighthouse. He only managed to write a few pages, and we don't know exactly what would have happened with the rest of them. We know that the day before he left Richmond, he left the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger a manuscript for his poem, Annabel Lee, and told him this was the last thing he'd ever written. But the Poe Society of Baltimore's Jeffrey Savoy has made a very convincing argument that this was actually an earlier draft of the poem. It wasn't the final version. Also, on that last day in Richmond, he's said to have sent a note and a manuscript for his poem For Annie to Susan Archer Talley. The note and the poem also missing, but we have every reason to believe that the poem was also maybe an early draft that he had lying around and decided to give it to her as a gift. So to find the last thing Poe ever wrote, we have to go back about 8 days earlier to September 18th, 1849, and he wrote 3 letters on that day. One of them was to his mother-in-law / aunt, Maria Poe Clem. She's the mother of his first wife, Virginia. And he's writing to her saying that he's making plans to marry Elmira Shelton back here in Richmond, but he also has a very lucrative project. He's gotten an assignment to edit a book of poetry up in Philadelphia for Mrs. St. Leon Loud. So he says that after he goes to Philadelphia, he's going to go to New York to the home of Stella Lewis and send for her, and she should come down from the Bronx, where she lives, to meet him in New York, and then they're going to head back to Richmond to live with Elmira and Elmira's son. So this is all we have left of the letter, but the rest of it was transcribed by Maria Clem, so we know what the rest of it says. The next letter he wrote that same day was to Stella, the one whose house he's going to visit up in New York. And it basically just showers her with praise, calls her Sister Anna, says how much he can't wait to see her and kiss her hand, really laying it on thick. And I think that's because he's planning on staying with her when he gets to New York, so he wants to make sure that it's a hospitable environment for that. And one thing we notice about this letter is there's no postmark on the back. With a lot of Poe's letters, you can look on the back and he just folds them up, writes the address on the outside, and there's a postmark there. This doesn't have that, so this was probably folded up and put inside of the letter to Maria Clem to save on postage, and Maria Clem was probably going to hand deliver that to Stella. And here's the third and probably final letter that Poe wrote that day. This one he addressed to Margaret St. Leon Loud in Philadelphia. She was a poet whose husband was a wealthy piano manufacturer. And she was about to come out with a collection of her new poems. Poe had praised her poetry in the past, loved it. So her husband just happened to be passing through Richmond, visited Poe, and said, I'll pay you $100 to edit her book of poetry. And Poe thought, this is a great deal. This is like a year's rent and just maybe a day's work. And Poe already liked her poetry, so it wouldn't have been that difficult for him. Would have been kind of a more pleasant project than editing Stella's poetry, which he really didn't like that much. So let's take a closer look. So the first thing you see that is on the back, there is the address and postmark like you would expect to see. And then check this out on the front. There's a watermark. You remember that Stella letter? That had a watermark too, the same watermark. Although Stella's watermark is on the other side, because what he did with hers was he cut the piece of paper in half right here, turned it sideways, and wrote her letter on there. So that's why her watermark is here instead of here. So he really was just writing a quick note for Stella. He didn't want to devote that much time. This is a little bit longer letter. And what Poe's doing here is he's making plans to go see Mrs. Leon Loud. And he says he's going to leave on the 25th of September to go see her. So he hopes to be able to meet her in Philadelphia by the 26th. And we know the way that Poe traveled back then. He would have caught a steamship from here to Norfolk to Baltimore. Would have taken about a day and a half to 2 days to get that far. Then the train from Baltimore to Philadelphia would have only taken a few hours more. They would have had to stop about halfway through to get off the train, take a ferry across the river, catch another train the other side, and take the train the rest of the way. But still, about 2 days before he sees her. And he'd already written to Mariah Clems saying, I'm going to see you maybe a day or two after I see Mrs. Loud. So Poe's got a pretty tight schedule. And that says to me, what was Poe doing in Baltimore? He wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't have time. He must have missed the train to Philadelphia and had to stay the night at the last minute. But why wouldn't he have caught the next morning's train? I think he's either the victim of illness or foul play. And the fact that he was found at a polling place on election day in somebody else's clothes suggests the latter. And that brings us just a little bit closer to unraveling the mystery of Poe's final days. What else can we see in this letter here? On the back, the owner has doodled. She apparently was having a very boring conversation with someone and needed to entertain herself, so she drew some little doodles and verses of poetry, wrote her name over a few times. And then you see these holes right here? This is where she sewed this into her album. And people back then kept albums of autographs or letters from famous people, so this would have gone into her album. And I prefer that she sewed it rather than to gluing it like a lot of people did. They glued their famous autographs and letters into albums, and that makes it really difficult to get them out of the album. In this case, it was able to come right out. And her grandson sent this to the Poe Museum back in the 1960s, about 120 years after Poe wrote the letter. And it's been here ever since. And what of that book of poetry? Did Poe ever get a chance to edit it? No, he never made it to Philadelphia. But this is the book, Wayside Flowers. And we know Poe didn't edit it because it has an introduction from the actual editor, which doesn't really even mention Poe. But one thing that's interesting is way in the back, there's this poem, The Stranger's Doom, which Matthew Pearl, the author of The Poe Shadow, the Dante Club, suggests is probably the earliest published description of Poe's death and funeral. Just to give away the ending, after Poe's death in Baltimore, it was a drizzly, dreary day, and 7 people showed up at a graveside ceremony since it was raining. They only stayed for a few minutes and took off. It was an unmarked grave for the next 26 years. And that experience of Poe dying, surrounded by strangers in the hospital, being buried in an unmarked grave, unmourned, seems to be reflected in this poem. It goes a little bit like this. They gathered round his dying bed, his falling eye was glazed and dim. But among the many gazers there were none who wept or cared for him. Oh, 'tis a sad and fearful thing to die with none but strangers near, to see within the darkened room no face, no form, no memory dear, to hear no loved, familiar voice, earth's sweetest music to the last, no whispered prayer, no stifled sob, not even an echo from the past. To feel when deeper still the shades of death have gathered o'er the brain, no clasping hand, no farewell kiss, pressed on the brow again, again. Yet thus he died, afar from all who might have mourned his early doom. Strange hands his drooping eyelids closed and bore him to his nameless tomb. They laid him where tall forest trees cast their dark shadows o'er his bed, and hurriedly in silence heaped the wild grass turf above his head. None prayed, none wept when all was o'er, nor lingered near the sacred spot, but turned them to the world again, and soon his very name forgot. So what do you think? Could she have written that poem about Edgar Allan Poe? And how do you think that Edgar Allan Poe died? Does this letter give us any more clues? Let us know down in the comments what you think. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces, like this copy of Mrs. St. Leon Loud's poetry, or probably the last letter that Poe ever wrote, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us. And this is how Edgar and Pluto let me know it's time for dinner.